that was against Jews and other groups of people.
Yeah.
And making them ugly. That's a very, very common thing that happens in propaganda. We did that during World War II to the Japanese. When you look at the cartoons from that era, when you look at the history of slavery, there was a kind of a campaign, a true campaign that was waged very convincingly, even from very academic and scholarly sources, to convince people that those who were enslaved were less than fully human.
Or that they were inferior.
Exactly.
Which is very similar to the scholarly campaign to scientifically justify anti-Semitism in Europe.
Yes. So all those things became of terrific interest to me. So then, going a little forward from 1999, when Ricky Birdsong was murdered, to 2001, after September 11th, when, of course, you know, the initial shock of the attacks of September 11th took hold of me, as just about everybody. But then I became aware of that sort of background noise that was not very well reported in the media, but just a few little reports of backlash attacks initially being directed towards people perceived as Arab or Muslim, or they weren't. They could have been Sikh or Hindu or South Asian or even Latino, and yet they were being all kinds of instances of assault and arson and vandalism and certainly teasing and bullying of kids in school, and women wearing hijab, wearing headscarves, having their scarves yanked off, or being sideswiped in the parking lots of grocery stores, and all of this based on appearance. And I became riveted by this subject and just sat at the computer researching it sort of for vast amounts of time. And there were actually murders that occurred in the United States in the aftermath of September 11th. And so I finally amassed a list of the people who were murdered in these types of incidents. And when Ricky Birdsong was murdered, we didn't actually know the Birdsong family. We lived one block over, and we didn't have kids the same age. And just as I felt compelled at that time to reach out to a family who lived around the corner from me and to respond and to try to think of how does one deal with this as a member of the community? What do you do when something like this happens in your community? I really felt the same way about these other murders. And the internet makes the world quite small in many ways, so I was able to contact some of the local clergy of the towns where these murders had occurred, and I ended up with some phone numbers of the widows of the men totally innocent men who had been murdered. And I picked up the phone one day, and the first person that I called was Anya Cordell in Texas, whose husband had been murdered in the gas station that he managed, and started a conversation that ultimately turned into a very close, warm friendship with her and her family. And then through similar but a little bit different circumstances, I ended up becoming a very close friend of a Sikh gentleman who had been murdered in Mesa, Arizona. And that was a real revelation, because a year after that murder, I was invited to speak at a memorial service for him by the Sikh community in Arizona. And my husband and daughter and I went to, at the invitation of the Sikh community. And we were house guests at the home of the murdered victim's brother and his family. And I had never met Sikh people before. So when the dad ran out onto the driveway and the two little boys with their turbans, it was a revelation to me. I had seen but didn't really know anyone who was Sikh. And within 5 minutes of being in their home, we just felt like long-lost family. And I think that's been one of the really amazing experiences for me, has been to be able to cross these bridges and get into other people's living rooms and have them in mine and really understand the common humanity that we often don't see when we put people quickly into the boxes and the stereotyping that happens.
When you talk in your on your website and in your promotional brochure about doing sessions, facilitating sessions, to break down these walls. In what way do you look to do that? I mean, if you don't mind talking about it without betraying any trade secrets.
I'm not sure this is a trade exactly, but I do programs for a variety of different venues, so ranging in age from about preteen to seniors. And I go into schools and churches, various faith communities, discussion groups, all sorts of library programming, a variety of situations. And I tell my story similarly to the way that we began. I talk about myself. I show some pictures on myself. The kids get a kick out of me with all the makeup and eyelashes and all of that. And I talk about this history and how I came to realize that we all understand this. And one of the things that I always try to remember to say is that even the people who are the truly beauties of our culture, the people who do look like closely or as close as you can to those magazine images, which are always photoshopped and doctored.
Anyway.
Exactly.
Have been throughout time, yeah.
Exactly. But nonetheless, there certainly are people who are attractive by our standards, but that they also suffer in various ways, that they sometimes are not perceived as fully human, that they're treated as beautiful instead of as full-fledged human beings.
As opposed to sentient beings.
Right. So I try to capture, the attention of my audience. And one of the things that I do now, as I show all of these various picture references, show the shoe and talk about the propaganda and advertising and all of that and how that operates, I usually show some picture references of a young artist who I met not too many years ago, who was born with severe anomalies of her hands and feet. And she started, as she grew up and decided that her aspiration was to make art, she made all of her art about this issue. And so in a variety of different ways, she wanted to highlight and really celebrate herself, because she had felt very much the opposite as a child, not celebrated and not fully accepted and embraced with this issue of her body as is. So, as is another little tag phrase that I use. And so when I show these pictures of her, that she's had made these very beautiful, very interesting photographs that really highlight this matter for her. Well, this year I underwent some major infection in my mouth and jaw that resulted in the loss of my 2 front teeth.
Ow.
So that, of course, was very traumatic, very devastating, and probably would have been more so if I weren't doing this work. I think that the